Hi there again, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Today I want to talk about two pivotal figures in post-war American foreign policy, the Dulles brothers. The reason why I want to talk about them is because sometimes it's important to steer away from this idea of the President of the United States as being the alpha and the omega of policy creation, international policy, foreign policy creation. The Dulles brothers, who are, not unknown, but far less high-profile figures in post-war foreign policy analysis than, say, for example, Kissinger. The Dulles brothers had an outsized role in shaping American foreign policy, American Cold War policy during the 1950s, and in a kind of extremely radically right-wing direction. The far more so than Eisenhower. The Dulles brothers, in fact, represented ideas that were probably right at the very edge of Eisenhower's thinking. It's not that Eisenhower wasn't above overthrowing governments and things like that, but the enthusiasm that the Dulles brothers had for it, John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State, and Alan Dulles as the director of the CIA, was really quite profound and shaped American foreign policy and the workings of the CIA significantly over the coming decades. So today what we're looking at is Grand Expectations by James Patterson, which is a kind of a general reader in post-war American history. It's a pretty good standard first text on the period 1945 to 74. But if you want to go deeper, you do need to read other stuff. But anyway, here we are. So he writes, Eisenhower's most important appointee, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, seemed at first to be a sound, indeed almost inevitable choice for the position. Dulles was the grandson of John Foster, President Benjamin Harrison's Secretary of State, and a nephew of Robert Lansing, who had held the post under Woodrow Wilson. Dulles had been personally concerned with international relations for almost 50 years and had attended the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. He had then become an influential attorney in New York and was part of the establishment network of well-placed lawyers and bankers who formulated post-war American foreign policy. In selecting Dulles, Eisenhower told his chief aide, Sherman Adams, "Foster has been in training for this job all his life." He reminded Emmett Hughes, "There's only one man I know who's seen more of the world and talked with more people and knows more than he does, and that's me." So you have Dulles, who's this kind of foreign policy insider. He had been at the Paris Peace Conference 4 decades before, 45 years before. He had been a significant player, even when not in government, in the shaping of foreign policy. And it's interesting, the point it makes here, which is very valid, that a sort of a small kind of talking shop of lawyers and bankers were those who shaped America's post-war foreign policies, particularly around trade, around debt, around the Bretton Woods institutions, and the kind of the foreign policy priorities are rarely made initially within the confines of the White House. They're made outside of it, and in various conversations that the presidents have with wealthy interest groups and the people within their social circles, these ideas kind of come to the fore. A classic, more contemporary example would be the late 1990s project for a new American generation, project for a new American century. which PNAC is something really, really important to look up, and is the guiding structure of the guiding document of US foreign policy all the way up to the present day. From the beginning, however, Dulles became a lightning rod for criticisms of Republican foreign policies. This was in part because he seemed extraordinarily influential. Some contemporaries, indeed, were sure that Dulles was the power behind the throne, and that Ike merely acquiesced into whatever Dulles devised. This was not the case. Eisenhower made all the important policy decisions himself. Indeed, the president was at times bored and irritated by Dulles, who tended to be preachy in meetings. The Secretary of State, Ike said on one occasion, has a lawyer's mind and tended to act like a sort of international prosecuting attorney. But critics of Dulles were correct in recognising that Eisenhower relied heavily on his secretary, who was a hard worker, knowledgeable, and wholly loyal in trying to carry out the president's goals. For these reasons, and because Eisenhower did not always monitor his subordinates closely, Dulles enjoyed considerable leeway and initiative. He held office, enjoying the president's confidence until he grew ill with cancer and had to resign in April 1959. Only then did Eisenhower step forward more boldly on his own as the spokesman for American foreign policy interests. Critics who took aim at Dulles fired off many grievances. They emphasised first of all that he was moralistic and self-righteous. This was often true. Dulles, the son of a Presbyterian minister, was influential in national church affairs. His strong Christian faith strengthened his distaste for communism, which he deplored as atheistic as well as unprincipled. Moreover, Dulles seemed humorless, at least on the job, self-assured and pompous. He had a habit of looking towards the ceiling. Some critics thought towards God. Hands calmly folded on his desk. While talking, critics said pontificating at considerable length. Other critics simply described his manner as dull, duller, Dulles. What most irritated Liberal opponents was Dulles' apparently inflexible and ideological anti-communism. This helped him acquiesce to McCarthy-inspired efforts to purge the State Department of alleged subversives and appeasers. I.F. Stone, the Liberal journalist, called him McCarthy's Secretary of State. While this charge was inaccurate, the critics were mostly correct in focusing on his anti-communist zeal. For Dulles, more than contemporary political leaders believed that the communist ideology, rather than strategic interests, determined Soviet behaviour, and that the Soviet Union had therefore had a grand design. So this is really interesting. That Dulles was one of the key drivers of a kind of a variant of McCarthyism, this idea of the grand design, the conspiracy theory, the idea that at all places around the globe and at all times, communist subversion was some evil plot that threatened to kind of overthrow liberal bourgeois capitalism. This is an idea that sort of still, even in the post-Cold War years, still kind of hasn't quite gone away. It has morphed into different conspiracy theories and ideas about kind of cultural Marxism and all this other crazy stuff. But it still exists, or a kind of a vein of it. And it appeals to those who imagine that the world is a place of kind of endless threat and conspiracy, and the realities about Soviet intentions after 1945 are often a lot more mundane. Stalin, after probably the Berlin airlift, imagined that there was little opportunity or scope for kind of expansion or subversion, and he was becoming progressively more interested in shoring up his own empire against people like Tito and Mao, who were taking wildly different directions in what they imagined communism to be. So the grand design is always a kind of an overstated concept. Perceiving issues in ideological terms, Dulles could be pickily legalistic when dealing with other political leaders. Some of those leaders were infuriated by his manner. Churchill said that Dulles was the only case of a bull I know who carried his own china shop with him. The journalist James Reston added that Dulles doesn't stumble into booby traps. He digs them to size, studies them carefully, and then jumps in. Analysis of Dulles's ideas and activities by historians has slightly softened this acidic portrait. Dulles was in fact politically shrewd, anxious to escape the vilification of the GOP right that had savaged Dean Acheson. He worked hard at protecting his standing with Conservatives in Congress, a very important consideration. It was also clear that Dulles was no more inflexible than Acheson or than the Truman administration generally, which had initiated no serious negotiating with the Soviet Union or China in many years. Dulles's style may have seemed more rigid, but in the end the result was much the same: more hardening of the Cold War. These reminders are useful. Still, few contemporaries saw a flexible, subtle side to Dulles. Publicly, in negotiations, he was mostly stern and unbending, with a harsh edge that not even Acheson had matched. Indeed, Dulles seemed an eager spokesman for a new administration that regularly denounced the Democrats as being soft on communism. And this was the key to undermining Truman. It had been the key to bringing down the Democrats who had been in power since 1932. The weapon that could be most easily used against them was that of national defence, that of being soft on communism. The fact that there had been a post-war, a wartime alliance with the Soviet Union, that after the war, communism had spread throughout Eastern Europe, it had spread through China. China had been lost. There had been multiple retreats that had been seen to happen on the Democratic front, and there was always this kind of lingering accusation of, well, how friendly had the Democrats really been? How friendly had Roosevelt really been with the communists during the war, and what connections were there between the communist administration, the Democrat administration, the Roosevelt presidency, and the Kremlin. And the fact is that in some instances there were clear connections, people like Harry Dexter White for example. And the post-war Venona decrypts suggested that there were numerous active Soviet agents in America at the end of the Second World War. So it was easy to be able to kind of fish through this sort of hodgepodge of evidence and create a conspiracy theory that the Democrats were somehow inclined towards the communists, which is obviously ludicrous, and there is no basis in fact for that. But often in the kind of the ruthless business of modern politics, there doesn't have to be a basis in fact for very much at all. The Central Intelligence Agency, headed by Foster Dulles's young brother Alan, was equally anti-communist. The agency, created in 1947, had grown slowly prior to the Korean War, but it had received authorization to conduct covert operations as early as 1948, using it to intervene at that time in Italian politics, and it grew rapidly in the early 1950s. By 1952, its budget had risen to over 82 million, its personnel to 2,812, plus additional 3,142 overseas contract personnel, and its number of foreign stations from 7 to 47. Under Eisenhower, Alan Dulles, a pipe-smoking bon vivant who was charming, popular with Congress, and well-connected socially as well as politically, it grew into an important government agency. The CIA had its first significant impact in the Eisenhower years. In the summer of 1953, it led a successful coup in Iran against Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, which earned the enmity of British leaders by nationalising their oil interests in 1951. The coup replaced Mossadegh with the pro-Western Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who agreed to a new charter that gave British and American oil interests 40% each of Iranian oil revenues. The Shah received a package of American economic aid worth $85 million. In June 1954, the CIA intervened again, and this time in Guatemala, in an effort to help rebels overthrow Colonel Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, the legally installed leader of the country. Arbenz Guzman's mistake had been to promote land reform by expropriating, with compensation, significant acreage of the American-owned United Fruit Company. Unbeknownst to the American people, CIA pilots joined in bombing raids that may have helped the coup to succeed. Eisenhower, fearing the spread of communism in Central America, was highly pleased with the result. "My God," he told his cabinet, "just think what it would mean to us if Mexico went communist." Because both of these coups were quickly and rather easily accomplished, and because some of the CIA's involvement remained secret, they did not attract great attention from the American press. This was unfortunate for several reasons. Firstly, the coups exacerbated internal divisions in these countries with disastrous long-range consequences for the people there. Secondly, the coups indicated the willingness of reporters that, at that time, and critically, to accept obfuscatory CIA cover stories. It was not until the late 1950s, when a U-2 reconnaissance plane under the control of the CIA was shot down over the Soviet Union, that significant numbers of reporters began to display a healthy distrust of the self-serving government handouts. Third, it was obvious that the coups involved well-placed economic interests. A thorough public discussion of these interests would have been useful in exposing the material forces that helped to drive America's Cold War behavior. Fourth, the coups convinced the CIA and other government officials that covert actions were easily carried out. In the next few years, it conducted other such operations in Japan, Indonesia, and the Belgian Congo. The bravado that such efforts engendered was to prove disastrous in later years. The coups were revealing in other ways as well. Americans who read about them seemed delighted with what they were allowed to know of the CIA activity. The CIA leader in Iran, Kermit Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's grandson, was acclaimed as a hero. Americans seemed unconcerned that the interventions violated sovereign rights. Foster Dulles was hardly challenged when he went on radio and TV following the coup in Guatemala to call it a new and glorious chapter for all the people of the Americas. Above all, the coups indicated the power of Cold War thought and action within the Eisenhower administration. Top officials argued that the communist elements linked to Moscow were key forces behind both Mossadegh and Arbenz Guzman. This was not so. Though Mossadegh belatedly turned to the Iranian Communist Party for help in order to bolster himself, he was fundamentally a nationalist. Arbenz Guzman was a reformer, not a communist. But the Dulles brothers easily convinced themselves, and many others, that communism lay at the root of international unrest. The coups in Iran and Guatemala revealed the key figures in the Eisenhower administration, perceiving the world in black and white, had at best a dim awareness of the appeal of nationalism and anti-colonialism throughout the world. Then and later, American officials would demonstrate this profound misunderstanding. So this, of course, colours most of US foreign policy in the Cold War period. This inability to recognise that events in Vietnam were largely of a nationalist or a national liberationist nature. That for the most part, Vietnamese Buddhist peasants had little interest in or understanding of the works of Karl Marx or Vladimir Lenin, and instead were interested in a more equitable distribution of the land and fewer or no foreign intervention in their country, and a sort of an end to the imposition of Catholicism on Vietnam, a almost largely Buddhist country. So these are the kind of the facts on the ground that motivated most of post-war decolonisation. Communism was largely a kind of a secondary factor, and there were all sorts of opportunities, particularly in the story of Vietnam, to create outcomes that might not have necessitated a communist regime in the north. But the black and white view of the world, the way in which the Dulles brothers perceived things, and they were not alone in the White House, they were not alone in Washington DC in seeing things in this way, actually exacerbated the tensions of the Cold War, and the moral capital that America seemed to enjoy at the end of the Second World War was quickly eroded throughout the 1950s and 60s, particularly by CIA covert actions, because the individuals that the CIA helped into power were inevitably the brutal anti-communist strongmen, the people who would drench countries in blood in order to smash trade unions, in order to eliminate the Communist Party. Figures such as Sukarno in Indonesia, figures such as Batista in Cuba, and the indifference of the American foreign policy establishment that worked on the idea that, well, they may be a bastard, but they are our bastard, and they are not the other side's. This is the key distinction. It doesn't matter what they do as long as you have and it doesn't really particularly matter if you have somebody who isn't a Democrat, who isn't going to uphold liberal democracy, but what they are going to do is they're going to remove the challengers to the global order that is being reshaped after 1945. They are the people that are going to remove the trade unions in countries that want better working conditions, higher wages, that will disrupt these sort of sensitive price signals for labour. They are going to crack down on nationalist movements such as Iranian nationalism that says our oil belongs to Iran and its revenue should pay for infrastructure and social services in Iran and that kind of thing. Going back last week, looking at the Panich and Sam Gindin's book, The Making of Global Capitalism, this was another part of the creation of the architecture of post-war global capitalism. These coups didn't happen for any other reason, really, than they are expedient to American and then latterly First World economic and geopolitical power. Otherwise, they wouldn't have occurred. So, the Dulles brothers, as twin ideologues, had an enormous amount to as their kind of legacy, really, that shaped Cold War politics. Nothing did more to sharpen, writes James Patterson, the tough-minded image of the Eisenhower administration and Foster Dulles' pronouncement of a massive retaliation policy in January 1954. The free world, he said, had properly tried to contain communism with measures such as the Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, and the dispatch of troops to Korea, but these were inadequate emergency reactions. Moreover, the free world could not match the mighty land power of the communist world. Instead, it must take the initiative and rely on the massive retaliatory power. The nation should depend primarily upon the great capacity to retaliate instantly by means and at places of our choosing. This would be more basic security at less cost. Dulles went on to say that warnings of such massive retaliation, nuclear weapons, if you didn't pick up on the subtext there, had brought the Chinese to heel in Korea in 1953. The secretary seemed to be proposing that an administration brandish nuclear weapons whenever confronted by an enemy. The idea, that statement that the Chinese were brought to heel by the nuclear threat in 1953 is highly debatable, shall we say, highly debatable. Dulles was not simply indulging in his fondness for stern and grandiloquent phrases. On the contrary, the National Security Council, which became much more important in policy making during the Eisenhower administration, had reconsidered defense doctrine in 1953 and had approved NSC 162/2 on October the 30th. This document emphasised the need for a nuclear-based strategy and for cost-cutting, mainly of ground-based forces in defence spending. Eisenhower had read Dulles' speech in advance and had apparently penned in the key passage calling for a policy based on a capacity to retaliate instantly by means and at places of our own choosing. Massive retaliation. The new look, contemporaries called it, was a carefully conceived administration policy, and we shall talk more about that in coming weeks, about the new look policy around nuclear first. Anyway, thanks very much for listening. Do keep checking out explaininghistory.org. There is more new stuff for students going on at the moment. I'm putting on plenty of content for students of the Russian Revolution, so go and check it out. Thanks very much. All the best, everyone. Bye-bye.